Shvuah Tov, everybody. We're going to do something a little bit different this week. Rather than concentrating primarily on the Parsha, I want to give over a shir that I did in my Beit Knesset on Shabbat, dealing with the period that we are in now, the Shabbat, the Nechemta, the connection between the end of Avelut by Tisha B'Av and the preparation towards Yom Kippurim. And we started with the question that I raised in Shul, is that if I'd ask you to make a list of the holidays you consider the happiest of holidays, the ones we rejoice in the most, what would be in the top of your list? And go from that until the bottom, where the more serious holidays would be found on the bottom of the list. What would be the holidays that you would place on top? Different reactions that I received was obviously Sukkot, Zaman Simchatenu, maybe Pesach, Hanukkah, Purim. These were the happiest holidays, and almost without anybody arguing, the most serious and solemn holiday that we would have would be Yom HaKippurim. That would probably be on the bottom of everybody's list. However, Kanireh Chazal had a different calculations when they were making up a similar list. The end of Masechet Ta'anit, the last Mishnah in Ta'anit, Perek Daled, Mishnah Chet, says as follows: Amar Reb Shimon bar Gamliel, Lo hayu yamim tovim l'Yisrael. There were no greater festive days in Israel. Ki chamisha asar ba'av v'yom HaKippurim. Nothing 1 and 2 on the list. First, I don't know again which one is 1 and which one is 2, but the first one mentioned is a holiday out of nowhere. I don't even know if it would be on my list of even holidays. Chamisha Asar B'Av, Tu B'Av is number 1. The only thing we know about Tu B'Av, how do we celebrate it as a holiday? We don't say Tachlim. That's it. And many people go by don't even knowing that it is Tu B'Av. Number 2, Yom HaKippurim. That's your most festive holiday. And it says why? Shebehen benot Yushalayim yotzot. On those 2 holidays, the girls of Yushalayim would go out, b'chlei lavan she'ulin, with borrowed white clothing. And why did they borrow clothing? Because they didn't, to equalize it, everybody would borrow clothing so that it wasn't be the rich women would have the beautiful gowns and the poor women would have rags. And then the Gemara Mishnah goes on to say, they would dance in the vineyards and try to attract the attention of potential shidduchim, of men, and they would give them advice on how they should make decisions in picking a wife. These were festive. Now, certainly today, I don't think we celebrate Yom Kippurim exactly the way it's described here in the Mishnah. So again, my question is, these are the 2 holidays that are on the top of your list? Doesn't make any sense. Now, it seems at least that the Gemara was also bothered by the listing of the Mishnah and agrees with my questions at least 50%. Because what does the Gemara say? This is the Gemara on, again, in Ta'anit, starting on Daf Lamed Amid Beis. Amar Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, Lo hayu yamim tovim l'Yisrael, chamisha asar ba'av Yom HaKippurim. It quotes the beginning of our Mishnah. Okay. So says the Gemara, Bishlama Yom HaKippurim. I understand why Yom Kippurim is mentioned in the Mishnah. B'shum de'isbei slicha u'mechila, and Yom shenitna baluchot ha'achronot. Okay, now maybe what the Gemara understood, again, I didn't understand Yom Kippur either, what's it doing there, but perhaps maybe if I look back historically, why maybe the first Yom Kippurim was a Yom Simcha, because the first Yom Kippur, the Jews thought they'd gotten a verdict that they were all Chayav Misa, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was going to kill them all because of Chay Ta'egel. Now, Moshe comes down from the mountain, and he tells him, I did the impossible. I am the greatest defense attorney since Alan Dershowitz. I got you off of a death sentence. wow, what is a simcha? And two, he came back not only with being that they were forgiven, but with a present. He came back with the Luchot Shniyot. So maybe what the Mishnah meant is that the first Yom Kippur was the day of unbelievable simcha, even though it seems that they celebrated it throughout history that way. Okay, so maybe it's going on historical precedent. But it says Ella Tu B'Av Mai. The Gemara says, but what in the world is Tu B'Av doing on that list? What is so special about Tu B'Av? So at least in one of the two cases, the Gemara agrees with my question. So the Gemara goes on to answer that question. What is special about Tu B'Av? And the Gemara is going to give us 6 reasons why Tu B'Av is special. Let's go through the 6 reasons. Number 1, Amr of Yehuda, Amr Shmuel. Again, this is not, interestingly enough, this is not in chronological order. Probably because the first 2 reasons deal with marriage issues, and the Mishnah seems to talk about the fact that girls went out for shidduchim, and maybe that's why these 2 reasons are mentioned first, even though they happened after. We'll see reason number 3. Amr of Yehuda, Amr Shmuel. Yom shehutru shvatim lavo zeh b'zeh. It was the day that the tribes were permitted to come and intermarry one with another. Now, what's the background behind this simcha? When the Jews were coming to Eretz Yisrael, so there was a question of allotting property. It was important that each tribe, it's interesting, they didn't come to Eretz Yisrael and say, oh, we're all in this together, we're all going to live together. No, each tribe had its own section and its own contribution to the greater federal good. And Beno Slavcha approached Moshe and say, listen, okay, the laws of Yerusha are basically that a son inherits his father. Our father Slavcha, Zichrono Livracha, he died in the Midbar, but he was one of the men over the age of 20 who left Mitzrayim, and legally he was entitled to a portion in Eretz Yisrael, but he died. Now he only has daughters. Baruch Hashem, 5 beautiful daughters, but we're all daughters. What happens to his portion? Does it just go to waste? Or as we, since we don't have any, he doesn't have any sons, can we, the daughters, inherit in place of the sons? Moshe brings their question to his Rebbe. He calls up a Kadosh Baruch Hu with the Shaila. Kadosh Baruch Hu tells him that in a situation where there are no sons, then the daughters take the place of the sons. They, in fact, would inherit. Beno Slavchot can inherit the portion of their father. When that psak was publicized, an uproar began in Shevet, in their Shevet, in Shevet Menashe. Are you kidding me? Because what's going to happen? So makbid on living together and lands belonging to certain shvatim. Who are they going to marry? They're not going to marry their relatives from Menashe, in most likelihood. They'll marry somebody from a different Shevet. And if that's the case, then what's going to happen? Then when they die, either their husbands, if their husbands are still alive, or their children will inherit for them, and the children will take the tribal distinction of their father, and the land that originally was supposed to go Menashe will now be given to a different tribe. What's going to happen? So again, Moshe says, good kasha. I see the problem. Goes back to Kodesh Baruch Hu, and God says, you're right. Beno Slavcha are right, and the tribe is right. Well, how can they both be right? So God says, well, what should happen is, yes, Beno Slavcha have a right to inherit. However, they're limited in who they can marry. They have to marry men from their tribe so that the land doesn't get transferred to a different tribe. Now that was extremely limiting, and but they did it. Says the Gemara, and it quotes what the source is. We're not going to go into the source. That on Tu B'Av they sat down and talked about this law, and going over it, they realized that law was only intended for the first generation who entered into Eretz Yisrael. It was a temporary law. Those people, when they first came to Eretz Yisrael and established their residency and they established their rights to the Yerusha, then if there was a scenario where there's only girls in those families, those girls should be limited to marry people from their family. But in subsequent years, there is no such halacha, and you won't find this halacha in the Shulchan Aruch. It was a temporary halacha, and Tu B'Av, it became publicized that in subsequent generations, these girls who inherit their father's property can marry from any tribe that they want. Okay, halacha number one. Halacha number two, the second thing that happened on Tu B'Av. What happened? Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Nachman. Yom Shehutar Shevet Binyamin Lavo B'Kahal. It was the second important thing that happened on Tu B'Av. It was the day that Shevet Binyamin was welcomed back into the general congregation. What's the story? What's the background behind this story? If you look at the end of Sefer Shoftim, the last couple of prakim in Sefer Shoftim, there was a horrific story of Pelegesh Begiva, concubine at Giva, where a man and his concubine went to a Airbnb in Shevet Binyamin, and they spent the night, and they were welcomed rather inhospitably by the neighbors of this Airbnb. Men surrounded the house. They wanted the man to come out and they wanted to sodomize him, just like it would happen in Sodom. The man, instead of doing that, he sent out his concubine, do whatever you want with her. And basically, they did the entire night. In the morning, the man wakes up, opens up the door and walks down the stairs, and his concubine is dead. And he is horrified, maybe horrified with his own behavior, but he takes a knife, cuts up the body, sends pieces to each of the leaders of the different tribes. This is what happened in Shevet Binyamin. I want a reaction by the Jewish people. The Jewish people are horrified. They demand of Shevet Binyamin to hand over the people involved, that there should be a trial and a reaction. Shevet Binyamin refuses. They felt it was an internal matter and they would take care of it. Tribes were not happy with that. They felt these were the family members. They would not be an objective verdict. And the civil war breaks out between Shevet Binyamin and the rest of Klal Yisrael. Almost the entire tribe is wiped out in this war. There were a few stragglers that were left. Interesting traditions. What happened to these stragglers? There's a tradition that some of them ended up in Europe, and there's even speculations that ultimately they married into the royal British family. Who knows if that's true or not? But that's what happened. And after the war, not only did they decimate the entire tribe of Binyamin, but the men who fought Binyamin made a vow that none of them would give over their daughters to the remaining members of Shevet Binyamin, which basically meant that Shevet Binyamin would die out and there'd be one less tribe. That was something that ultimately, when they calmed down, realized that would be a horrific thing. You can't have, we're not going to get into the whole idea of Yud Beis Shvatim, the Achdus Hashem based on the Yud Beis Shvatim. That would be something that should not be tolerated. So what are they going to do? But they made a nether. Now, again, I don't understand why that wasn't reason enough that somehow the Rabbanim should get together and be mated in nether. Had they realized what would happen to Shevet Binyamin, would they have ever made the nether? But that didn't happen. But again, they sat down, looked at the text of the nether, and they realized that the text indicated that it would only be the people who fought in the war. That first generation wouldn't give over their daughters. But their children, if they had daughters, they could give over their daughters. That nether didn't apply to them. So that decision was made on Tu B'Av, so that it was possible for people from Shevet Binyamin to once again marry and other people have a chance to repopulate the tribe. And that was, again, a cause, an important occasion. why, therefore, Tu B'Av was a happy day. Shevet Binyamin was saved. A third explanation. Rabba Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Yom Shekalu Bo Meisei Midmar. It was the day that the people who were supposed to die in the Midbar died. What happened? We know that as a result of Chet HaMeraglim, the Jews were told that instead of going straight into Eretz Yisrael, they would have to spend the next 38 and a half years in the desert in the Midbar. And that the men over the age of 20 who left Egypt would die in the Midbar. They would not come into Eretz Yisrael. Okay. And the Gemara in other places describes how that happened. They didn't just die in normal deaths. Everybody died on Tisha B'Av, on subsequent Tisha B'Avs. What would happen? They described the process where the men would, I don't know what the women did, but the men would dig graves, and Tisha B'Av night, after reading Eicha, or there was no Eicha, but whatever to do with Tisha B'Av night, they went to sleep in the graves, and in the morning, some of them didn't have to say Moda Ani, and some did. Approximately 15,000 men died every year, so that at the end of 40 years, it would be 600,000 men would have died. Okay, the last year was included. The year before they came into Eretz Yisrael, again, the men dug graves, but in the morning, no one had died. Everybody woke up. Can't be. There were still at least 15,000 people that were supposed to die that year. So they said, well, maybe we made a mistake in the dates. Maybe we made Rosh Chodesh a little bit too early, and maybe it's not Tisha B'Av, maybe it's the 8th of Av, the 7th of Av. So they repeated the process the next night, and then the next night, and the next night, until they got to the middle of the month. When they saw there was a full moon, they knew darn well that Tisha B'Av had passed, and they were positive that they hadn't made a mistake. And they realized that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had forgiven them from the sin of Chet HaMeraglim, and that they would not die in the Midbar, and they would come into Eretz Yisrael. When did they realize that? On Tu B'Av, when they saw the full moon in the sky in the middle of the month, and that's when they realized that occurred, therefore, on Tu B'Av. Now again, this is the story that's brought down. This is what our Gemara seems to say. It's a difficult opinion to say that this thing actually occurred, certainly the way I'm explaining it, because we have an open pasuk in the Torah that tells us that the only two people above the age of 20 who made it into Eretz Yisrael were Kalev ben Yefuna and Yeshua ben Nun. And now we're saying 15,000 other people at least got in. Okay, difficult, but again, that's the third reason that our Gemara seems to state. A fourth reason, Ula Amar, Yom Shabitel Hoshea ben Elah Peros Diot. It was the day that Hoshea ben Elah, the last king of the Mamlechet Yisrael, the northern kingdom, he removed the guards. Shahoshiv Yeravam ben Nevat al Hadrachim, that Yeravam ben Nevat had placed on the roads, Shelo Yalu Yisrael L'Regel, so that the Jews should not go to Yerushalayim, to the Beit HaMikdash, on the Shlosh Galim. The Amar, and he said, anybody who wants to go to Yerushalayim, you now have the option to go to Yerushalayim. Because what had happened, we know the story that on Shlomo and King Solomon's death, Shlomo's death, his son Rechavam wasn't able to hold on to the entire Yud Beis Shvatim, and there was a split in the country. 10 tribes created the northern kingdom, and the tribe of Binyamin and Yehuda were left in the southern section of Eretz Yisrael, and that's the way it went. And Yeravam was worried, and he realized that the first one of the Shlosh Regalim would come up, the people from his tribe would want to go to Beis HaMikdash. They would send them back into the territory that was under the control of Rechavam, And maybe they would be comfortable there. They'd have second thoughts, the unity of the people, the Beis HaMikdash, and they might want to change their minds about separating from Malchus Beis David. So he made sure that people weren't allowed to go to the Shosh and come into the Beis HaMikdash. So what are you going to do? It's a holiday. They're Jews. They know it's a holiday, and they want to, recognize that to Kodesh Baruch Hu. So he made his own temples up in the north. Interesting, he didn't just copy the Kalim of the Beis HaMikdash for some reason. Instead, he went with another symbol that didn't really work well the first time they tried it. He made two golden calves, and he said, "This is what you'll go to these temples." And he put guards along the way, so that people weren't able to take the highway and go into Yerushalayim. So on the 15th of Av, so Hoshea ben Elah, the last king of Israel, removed the guards and said, "Now you have an option. You want to daven locally, daven locally. You want to go to make Ali al-Regel, you want to go to Yerushalayim, you have that option." Now, there are people that ask, interesting, if you did such a big thing after hundreds of years of not allowing it, then why in the world was Dafka, the 10 tribes, exiled during his reign? It's interesting. So the answer given is because, he removed the guards, but no one went. So at least before they didn't go, they had guards, they had an excuse why they didn't go. Now we removed the excuse. Now it's even worse. The fact that people had the option and didn't avail themselves of that option made it even worse for them. Okay, maybe. Next, fifth reason mentioned in the Gemara. Rav Masna Amar, Yom Shenitna Haruge Beitar L'Kvura. It was the day, and we discussed this before. I think it was the day that the Haruge Beitar were given over for Kfura. What happened at Beitar? About 60 some years after Churban Bayit Sheni, the Jews had been under Roman rule. And it's interesting, all the oppressiveness of the Roman rule that we talk about. I mean, it wasn't great after Churban Bayit Sheni, but it wasn't as difficult. Most of the oppressions occurred after the Jews started rebelling against Rome under the Bar Kokhba revolt. And Rabbi Akiva supported the Bar Kokhba revolt, and originally he had some successes, a lot of successes for 2 or 3 years. The Gemara says there were about 900 communities that he reconquered, and there was some type of ruler, independent political authority, and they minted coins. But eventually, the Bar Kokhba rebellion failed. The last battle was at a place called Beitar, and every Jew fell. There are more Jews killed at Beitar than there were during Churban Bayit Sheni, if I'm not mistaken. And as a reminder to the Jewish people, or to anybody, of what happens to people that rebel against the Roman Empire, there was a decree that the bodies of those who died at Beitar were not allowed to be buried, and many of them were actually crucified. They made like a fence around the vineyard with bodies, Jewish bodies, and they would leave it there as an andarta, as a monument, to show people should come and see. Look what happens to the bodies. In the middle of the summer, then the bodies will start to smell, the bodies will decay. So it's adding insult to injury for anybody who even has a havamina rebelling against Rome. But as tragic as the fall of Beitar was, there was some nechama within the tragedy as well. The bodies didn't decay. They didn't come back to life either, but the way they were, the moment that they died, that's the way they remained for a long period of time. For 3 years, they were up there. And at a point, as it was going on week after week after week, year after year, the Romans realized that the embarrassment was on them. The Jews, not only, they can't even die the way normal people die. And the fact that this nace was happening was a pointed finger at them. They finally relented and allowed the bodies to be taken down and to be given a Jewish burial. When did that decree come that the Haruge Beitar could be buried? 3 years after the battle on Tu B'Av. final reason that's offered in the Gemara, Rabba Rav Yosef Yamar Tavayu, Yom Shepasku Milichros Eitzim L'Maracha. It was the day that when they finished cutting the wood for the pyre on the mizbeach. Because what would happen? Where it says Rav Elazar Hagala Omer Mechamisha Asar Ba'av Ve'elach Tashas Kocho Shalchama V'lo Hayu Korsim Eitzim L'Maracha Lefi She'enon Yeveshim. Because what happened was you needed in the base of Mikdash wood to be totally dry. If it was somewhat moist, it could become wormy and would not be able to be used in the base of Mikdash. They only would cut wood until Tu B'Av, because starting at Tu B'Av, the day becomes shorter. There are less hours of sunlight. The wind, and even a slight change, interestingly enough, is not good enough. We want pristine wood, right? Like, and everything that we do in Avodas Hashem has to be 100%, not 99.9. So they would make a party on Tu B'Av. The fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that there was enough wood in the forest to provide wood for the entire year, that party would be made on Tu B'Av. It was now the Gemara goes on to go give one more comment on this last point, that it was also indicating that now there was a day of Simcha because now they had more time for learning. And their days, it was interesting. Why did God create a world where there's sunlight and darkness? Why isn't it just 24/7 sunlight? Because sunlight was the time given to go out and work and make a living, but you also needed time to take time off and sit and learn. Nighttime was the time for learning. So the simple was, now Shki is a minute earlier than yesterday, and tomorrow it'll be 2 minutes earlier than yesterday. I have a minute more to be able to sit and learn. What a simcha. So these are the 6 reasons. The Gemara says, you want to know why Tu B'Av is on that in the listing of that Mishnah? 6 things happened on Tu B'Av. So first of all, I have a problem that we have a rule that when you have a question and you have number of answers, it indicates that you don't really have one answer that's a knockout punch. None of these answers are sufficient to stand on their own. So you really, even at the end, they're giving these answers, you really don't know why Tu B'Av is on that list. And especially when you look, all these things are important ideas on their own, but there are plenty of other important occasions that happen in Jewish history, which I would say even more important than some of them mentioned here. Not all of them, but some of them certainly mentioned here by Tu B'Av. And yet we make no commemoration of their occurring at all. One example, just to quote you, is I have friends of mine, for example, who make a kiddush or a su'udah on the anniversary of the date that they made Aliyah. That was a significant moment in their personal life, total change in what they did. And yet, when the Jews as a nation first made Aliyah, when the Jews crossed over the Yarden, and certainly in a more miraculous way than we make Aliyah today, there's no holiday commemorating it. I even asked most of you, what was the date that the Jews crossed over the Yarden? I don't know if you would be able to tell me. So even knowing these reasons, these reasons were good enough to catapult Tu B'Av to the number 1 holiday on the list of in Tanya, doesn't make any sense. Until I was looking and trying to find out an answer to this question, and of the reasons mentioned for celebrating Tu B'Av, 2 of them stood out to me, because 2 of them were also related to another list that appears in another Mishnah in Ta'anit, right before the Mishnah that I quoted you. In Perek Dalet, Mishnah Vav, it mentions 5 things that happened on Shiva Asar Tammuz, and it mentions 5 things that happened on Tisha B'Av. What happened at Tisha B'Av? Number 1, Chet HaMeraglim, that the Jews weren't allowed to come into Eretz Yisrael. Number 2 and 3, 2 was Churban Bayit Rishon, 3 was Churban Bayit Sheni, 4 was Nilkata Beitar, the destruction of the city of Beitar, which we just mentioned, and 5, Nechru Sha'ir, the city of Yerushalayim was plowed over and was put sulfur on it because for various reasons, but for the same reasons we go through today politically, the Romans wanted to destroy Keilu, that the Jews had no historical connection to the city of Yerushalayim. There should be no sign remaining that Yerushalayim once belonged to the Jews. And again, interesting enough how they made a mistake and left the Kotel Maravi. Okay, but 2 of the items on the list by Tisha B'Av immediately caught my attention, that they're related to 2 of the reasons that we discussed here in Tu B'Av. Namely, reason number 1 was that the first reason for Tisha B'Av, what happened was the first thing that happened Tisha B'Av, the fact that the Chet HaMeraglim and the Jews, as a result, the Jews weren't allowed to come into Eretz Yisrael. Here, the opposing reason that we have, one of the reasons for Tu B'Av was the fact that Gezerah in some way was forgiven, and that we mentioned that the last 15,000 people that were supposed to die didn't end up dying. So Kilu, God forgave us for the Chet Egel, and the punishment was not carried out 100%. The second obvious connection was the idea that we talked about Beitar, that one of the reasons for fasting and mourning on Tisha B'Av was the fall of Beitar, but here we discussed that on the 15th of Av, 3 years later, the fact that there was a miracle that the bodies didn't die and the Romans relented and finally allowed these bodies to get a Jewish burial, that's refuah for the Makkah. That's a clear connection of these 2 events. So I started asking myself, well, if that's the case, what about the other things mentioned about Tu B'Av? Could we find the connection? So it's interesting, while I was thinking about it, and I had some ideas, I happened to notice on the internet that Rav Breidowitz had given a shiur relating these 2 things, and what I'm about to quote you, the other 3 reasons are pretty much what Rav Breidowitz had said. Churban Bayit Rishon, one of the reasons quoted for Tisha B'Av. What was the reason why the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed? A violation of the 3 basic principles of Gilei Arayos, Shfichas Damim, Avodah Zarah, probably with everything else as well, but even these, the big 3. But Avodah Zarah was the root cause of almost everything. Okay, what's corresponding to that in our list by Tu B'Av? The fact that Yom Shebitul HaShomrim, the day that the Shomrim were taken out of the Norman Kingdom, right? Because basically the Jews in the Norman Kingdom were forced into Avodah Zarah. Now they had an option. If you want to, you don't have to be Oved Avodah Zarah. We're relenting on that fact. You have an option to worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That seemed to be for that Makkah. Churban Bayit Sheni. What was the cause of Churban Bayit Sheni? The Gemara says not because they were from in Churban Bayit Sheni. It was Sinat Chinam. Well, where does that find its mate, not to make the pun, on Tu B'Av, when the tribes were permitted to marry one another, and especially Shevet Binyamin, where there was a certain amount of animosity towards them, and they relented, and they didn't want Chas v'Shalom. They wanted to show their brotherly love. They didn't want Chas v'Shalom, one tribe, to be removed from Jewish people. So a reparation of that sinah was found in these 2 reasons on the list of Tu B'Av. And last but not least, Nechru Sha'ir. How does that fit in with the reason? It's a little bit forced, but this is best. I don't think I could have done any better. He explains that the very fact that Simcha, where we had forests that were produced all this wood to be able to not only provide for trees and everything else, but to provide wood for the Beis HaMikdash, showed the fertility of Eretz Yisrael. That was the antidote to the attempt to destroy the productivity of Eretz Yisrael, and that there is a connection between the two. Meaning that for every tragedy that occurred on Tisha B'Av, there seemed to be a nechama, some of nechama on Tu B'Av. And these two holidays are related. If that's true, maybe I want to, and I'll go back to discuss, and maybe that's why Tu B'Av was there. And maybe, you know what? That might also answer my question of what Yom Kippurim is doing on that list. Because what is Yom Kippurim? Yom Kippurim is a nechama, is a slicha of the other major sin that occurred in the Midbar, namely Chet HaEgel. And the simcha, perhaps, that we get from these 2 days is an important simcha, and a really important simcha, because these were two terrible, terrible sins. Chet HaEgel, not only what we did, but according to Chazal, we violated again all three averos of Chet HaEgel. There was Avodah Zarah, there was Kumalut Tzachek, there was Gilei Arayos, and according to many traditions, Chur was murdered. That's why Chur's name is never mentioned again in Tanakh. There was Shvichas Damim 40 days after Kabbalah Satorah, and yet God was able to forgive us in Yom Kippurim. And similarly, the Chet HaMeraglim, God was about to take us to Eretz Yisrael, and we said we didn't want to go, and that what happens, you have a situation here where Yom Kippur, where as we saw, there was a reconciliation. There was a Tu B'Shvat had its nechama in Tu B'Av, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu forgave us, and that's an important simcha, because one of the classic theological debates that take place in the world today is the fact that the nations of the world, ironically enough, they all believe in what they called the Old Testament, that we call Tanakh. The only people that don't believe it might be Jews themselves. But non-Jews, especially from non-Jews, they know the Bible better than many rabbis know the Bible. And they believe in the Old Testament. They believe in the Jews were in Egypt. They believe that God took us out miraculously from Egypt. They believe that Moses was a prophet and that he gave us the Torah and Har Sinai. They believe it all. Where do we differ? They hold that at one point, God rejected us. God brought us into Eretz Yisrael, did all this chesed for us. And then what happened? We rebelled. There was Churban Bayit Rishon. But God is a merciful God. He gave us another chance. Just like in Israel, we had what's called Moed Bet. Okay, we had Moed Bet. And yet, even then, we didn't appreciate that opportunity, and we blew it again. And now there was a second Churban Abayis. At that point is where the nations say, God said, enough. I am now going to start over, Rahman al-Islam, with a new Israel. That's where we differ. And for a couple thousand years, history seemed to say that they were correct. They claim what's the job of a Jew now to continue existing in the world, to show, just like the Romans wanted to show, what happens to a people that rebel against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They'll be poor, they'll be oppressed, they'll be murdered. That's your job. That's your contribution to the world. So the rest of the world remain from. We never bought that. Why didn't we buy that? Because we believe in the fact that the HaKadosh Baruch Hu forgave us even for these horrific sins. God can forgive us for anything. And these two holidays are the things that brought us hope and simcha throughout eternity. In fact, this might be the tie-in to our parsha. In this week's parsha, there's a pasuk. It's in Perek Ches. The three psukim. I forgot my chumash. Wait, let me see. Anyway, there's three psukim. Hopefully, I have one here. Yeah, in the Devarim. Sorry, Perek. What did I say? Perek Chet, starting from Pasuk Gimel. It says as follows. Okay, hold on. I'm in the wrong parak. Okay. Parak Chet, Pasuk Gimel. In the midbar, God gave us man lamano diacha ki lo alechem levado yechia hadam ki al kol motzah pi Hashem yechia hadam. 40 years we ate man. Teach us a lesson. Everything comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, here's the pasuk I want to concentrate on. Simlascha lo bolsa me'alecha. Your clothes didn't get worn out. Now, again, there was no shopping to be done. There was no place to go shopping. No place. God specifically, for 40 years, kept them isolated from the rest of the world. Theoretically, they could have gone to locations that were bordering on other nations and bought food from them for 40 years. That's not what happened. The food was provided from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and what about clothes and everything else? 40 years, your clothes didn't wear out, and didn't only wear out. Like, so I'll say, well, it's not just good enough they didn't wear out. What about when I went out of Egypt, I was 4 years old, and now I'm 44 years old. Can't wear the same thing I was wearing as 4. Miraculously, the clothes grew with you. In fact, according to Chazal, the Ananei HaKavod laundered the clothes. It wasn't, they didn't have. I mean, they got water to drink. They had water to wash clothes and to dry clothes. I don't know what they did. Says the one, no, they were even laundered, dry cleaned by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Your feet, right there, your shoes also didn't wear out. 40 years of tiulim in the desert. What a quality control product. No shoe lasts that long. Not even Rockports, or anything else that we're wearing. That a year or 2 years maximum. That's it. 40 years, and your shoes also probably grew with you. When God punishes you, He punishes you the same way parent punishes a child. But even when He punishes you, may be disappointed in you, but He still loves you. So here is the idea that it's interesting. This was a miracle that was done for our clothing and our shoes, but this miracle only happened because we messed up. The original plan was to come into Eretz Yisrael, within a year, a maximum within a year. I don't know, maybe even earlier, but certainly with no more than a year. We weren't supposed to spend 40 years in the Midbar. So maybe the money we needed immediately, but we didn't need the clothes to change, and we didn't need the shoes to grow with us. This was a miracle as a result of our sin of Chet HaEgel and Chet HaMeraglim. Right? That's what we say when we're going to start Slicha soon and Chodesh Elul. Hashem Hashem, Kal Rachum Mechanu. What do you mean Hashem Hashem? Why is the double repetition? Rashi says one is Yud Kei Vav Kei means Midas Harachmim. One is Kan Lifnei Achet, and one is Liacharei Achet. There's an added element of Chesed, not only before we sin, but even after we sin. Because sometimes we need even more Chesed, because God doesn't want to do us any favors. We don't deserve any favors, and God does it anyway because He loves us, because we're always considered the children of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In fact, this is a famous Gemara in Sota, and if you want to look it up, it's on Sota Yudalad Amud Aleph. Talks about the fact that Rav Samloi says that the beginning of Torah is Gemilas Chasadim, and the end of Torah is Gemilas Chasadim. What's the example of Gemilas Chesed in the beginning of Torah? But it says, "Vayas Hashem Elokim le'adam ulishto kasnas or v'yal b'shem." The example in the beginning is the fact that God made clothes for Adam and Chava. Again, I'm not going to get into the last example, right? But Moshe being bare. So everybody asked the kasha, that's the beginning of Chesed? When God made designer clothing from Adam and Chava instead of them wearing, I don't know, the olive leaves that they had on them, whatever leaves that they had on them. The first act of Chesed, when God created the world, was an act of Chesed. Olam Chesed Yibana. the fact that God created Chava, the fact that God made Gan Eden. I mean, there's so many other things you could have, you quoted Bereshit bara Elokim. God didn't have to create the world, and he did. That's the first act of chesed. That's the Torah opens up in chesed. Why wait till he made designer clothing for them? So Rav Simcha Zisel says very simply, what is Gemilas Chesed? It doesn't say that the Torah begins with chesed and ends with chesed. It begins with Gemilut Chasadim. What's Gemilut Chasadim as opposed to chesed? The word Gemul means you get paid back for something that you deserve. You worked for somebody for a day, you deserve a salary at the end of the day. That chesed is when I do something from you when you didn't necessarily do something to deserve it. I see somebody in the street who I don't know looking for money, and I give him tzedakah. He didn't do anything for me. I'm doing it for him, and I don't even know who the guy is. That's chesed. Gemilas chasadim seems to be a contradiction in terms. And the idea, says with Simcha Zisel, is that this is an example of a Kodesh Baruch Hu doing chesed, even if it wasn't deserved. What is the Gemara saying? That where is there an example that God doesn't only do chesed when we deserve it, God does chesed even when we rebelled against God, because God always loves us. And the first example of that is after Adam and Chava sinned by not listening to God, by ate from the Eitz Hadas, he still did chesed for them. That's a beautiful, beautiful thought. Right? So that why are these two holidays top of the list? They are days of unbelievable simcha, because they remind us of the connection of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to the Jewish people, that's eternal. We are like children to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And even when we don't act the way we're supposed to act, God will not reject us, the way the other nations of the world said. And that not only does not God reject us, he increases his hashgacha over us so that we're able to survive whatever troubles are coming along the way. And that, as we see in this week's Parsha, of the nace, the shoes, and the clothing, which originally wasn't on the agenda, and we certainly didn't deserve it, but God added it on. So this is point number one. Point number two, relevant bismanenu, is the fact that Tu B'Av and this period between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur represents the Shevet and Chemta. It's our preparation towards the Yomim Noraim. And Tu B'Av is actually the last day of Shiva that we started on Tisha B'Av. And there's a minhag. There is a minhag that the last day of Shiva, we don't sit the entire day. Mixas Hayom Kukulo. Basically, on the seventh day, there's davening in the house, and then after davening, people go over to the mourners and say, "Get up," and you're supposed to get up. Why are we supposed to get up? And it's an important part of the Shiva process, because the reaction, the Gemara talks about the reaction of the Jewish people after Churban Bayit Rishon. There are those that say that our world is over. And the Gemara says people said they stopped eating meat. We're not going to have simcha of eating meat. Why? How can we eat meat when there's no longer korbanos being offered in the Beis Hamikdash? Okay, and they stopped drinking wine. Why? Same logic. How could we drink wine? There's no libations that are being poured on the korbanos in the Beis Hamikdash. So the Rabbanim said back to him, well, why stop with, not eating meat, not having wine? Don't have bread. There's no meal offerings being offered in the Beis Hamikdash either. Why have water? Don't drink water, because on Sukkot you had Nisa Chamayim, and there's no longer going to be Nisa Chamayim on the korbanos and Sukkot either. So basically, you could stop living. There's no longer reason to live. And the idea is you can't do that. You can't, yes, there's a time for mourning and being devastated and trying to figure out what happened and what went wrong and how we can correct that. But you also have to get up. You have to rise up from your avelut and continue life and continue your purpose in life. Without that, you're nothing. And that's why Soloveitchik has you look at the last kina that we have in Yom Kippurim is Elit Zion Yahara. And it's ironic. I always was bothered by the fact that first of all, we sing it. I mean, how do you sing about the terrible thing. Oh, great, they killed us. How do you sing like that? And we stand up. We get up from sitting down. At the end, and that's the kima, because if you realize there's light at the end of the tunnel, but you think that light is an oncoming train, you're in trouble. And I told this story in shul, and unfortunately, it's a true story of a student of mine who, when I was in my first teaching job, was in Yeshiva University in Los Angeles, was in LA. And when I first went out there, I was taking Yurt there. I was only teaching there part-time. And they gave me a class in adult education. I was dealing with people from the community rather than people in Yeshiva in this particular series of classes. And there was a bunch of classes, preparation for the Yom Noraim. I think it was a 6-lecture series. And I had this one guy who came to all my classes. He was there, and he was so into it. He would stay after class and ask me questions. He spent Yom HaKippurim in the yeshiva. And this was a big thing. Person wasn't from. Spent the whole day in yeshiva. And I'm saying to myself, after Yom Kippur, he left, he ate with us, and he left. I'm saying to myself, wow, you are amazing. You're in chinuch for a month, and you've already changed one person's life. You are great. Okay, pat myself on the back. A couple of days later, Chol HaMoed Sukkos, I get a phone call from one of the local hospitals. Are you Rabbi Wruble? Again, this is before the days of cell phones. They had called the yeshiva, they had to get me. Okay. Yes, I am Rabbi Wruble. He says, do you happen to know this guy? He mentioned his name. I said, sure. He says, we're calling from a local hospital. He tried to commit suicide last night. I'm saying, was it something I said? Wow. I don't know what happened. This was my hope. Because the one guy was so positive. So I went to visit him in the hospital. He tells me the story of his childhood. What a messed up, I don't want to necessarily put down the state of California, but if you talk about all these classic California stories, this guy had done it all. And he said to me, we're talking about Kedusha, holiness, and this, and how can God forgive all those things that I've done? So instead of trying to do tshuva and move on from that, he said there's no hope. And we don't believe that. Again, we don't believe that, as we've proven in the examples that we gave. Almost, what you've done, you did. Sometimes you can't make up for what you did, right? Or maybe you could. Making a tshuva can do that, but what's done is done. The only thing you can do from now on is how you're going to change, how you're going to change your life from the present onwards. That is the decision that you have to ask yourself. And you can never think that God will not forgive you. In fact, again, another example is the Gemara in Sanhedrin, famous Mishnah, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek li'olam haba. Every Jew has a portion in the world to come. The parak before that, in the Gemara, deals with the Daled Misos Bezdin, the 4 different types of miso, death penalties a person gets for having violated the most serious of crimes. And the Marsha says that why is Chelek, the Mishnah Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek, after that parak, is to include even those people that may have violated the Daled Misos crimes of Daled Misos Bezdin. They have the ability to do tshuva. So that, in essence, the period between Tisha B'Av, Tu B'Av, and it is we start. We can't leave it to the last minute. These periods, Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, are related not only of days of Simcha historically as being forgiveness, but today Yom Kippurim is what gives us our kapara, and Tu B'Av is when we start that. It's a slow process that we work up to. And in fact, I think the message, even if you look back to the Mishnah, might also be important to that. If you look again at the Mishnah, this is part of the Mishnah I did not quote you, when it talks about girls going out into the streets, dress and clothing. Okay, fine. What did they say? So there are a number of examples mentioned in the Gemara, what they said to the men to try to convince them to take them out. The Mishnah doesn't quote all of them. Listen what the Mishnah quotes. It says as follows. Umahayu amrot. What did the girls say? Bachur, young guy, young man. young man, it's a song like that. Sana inecha urei, lift up your eyes and see. Ma'ata barelach, how do you make decisions? Who you're going to marry? Al titain inecha banoi, don't look based on what girls look like. Now, obviously, probably the good-looking girls probably did not say this, but don't judge women by externals. Look at where they came from internally. Sheker achein v'hevel ayofi, isha yiras Hashem hi tisalo. But basically, what are they saying to them on Tu B'Av? How do you make decisions to lead your life? Are you making decisions in a proper way? What are your priorities? Are your priorities money? Are your priorities kavod? Are your priorities enjoyment? Or do you have a deeper meaning and purpose in life? And that question that the girls asked the men on Tu B'Av is a question that every Jew, married or single, has to ask themselves, right, about themselves. How are we making decisions in life? Because there's a Yom Hadin approaching. And God gave each and every one of us a talent and a challenge and a purpose in life. Are we fulfilling this purpose? I think, again, I'm just going to close with a famous story, the Rav Zusha story. That Rav Zusha once said, the famous Hasidic leader Rav Zusha, that a lot of when he was going to die at Me'av Esrim Shana and go up to his heavenly court, he wasn't afraid of the questions that they were going to ask him. They asked him, why didn't you become Moshe Rabbeinu? I didn't become Moshe Rabbeinu because I didn't have the potential of Moshe Rabbeinu. I didn't have his intelligence. I didn't have his neshama. Why weren't you David HaMelech? I'm not worried about that question. What question am I worried about? Zusha, why weren't you Zusha? Here I created you with a certain potential. Yeah, certain challenges, but certain potentials. Why didn't you live up to those potentials? You could have been so much more than you are. That question frightens me, says Zusha. And that's the question that, again, why are these days significant? These holidays remind us, God, okay, what you did in the past, you did in the past. Don't ever think that what you did, you can't do tshuva for. You never know. It won't be any better if you don't do tshuva. You can turn your life around today. And there's so many examples of people within a second turn their life around and did tshuva. And we have to start now asking ourselves this important question. And that's why these holidays are important. And because if we ask these questions and we change our lives based on them, they will lead to the ultimate simcha. Tu B'Av and is the beginning of the transition towards Yom Kippur, to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Halavai, we should take the message of these holidays to heart. They should ask ourselves the appropriate questions and to objectively criticize or to analyze how we're living. Are we living up to our potentials? If not, why not? And do something about it. Shabbat Shalom Kulam.